Peggy Flynn, and I'm president of the Cabrillo. Yeah, that's it, right, of the Democratic Women's Club. So thank you all for coming. You know, the Democratic Women's Club for years has done programs every Saturday morning, and usually in the police department of downtown Santa Cruz. And we've been expanding our programs, or actually making them more quarterly and bringing them to more of the community. Dare I say DEI. You know, we're making a bigger tent. We want more people, and our diversity is age and income and cultural differences and geography and everything, and that's what we're doing this year. So we're a lot of internal infrastructure building, so quarterly programs are working better for us. So I'm not actually going to introduce Chris, though I will say that many of us saw him at the Santa Cruz Works when he got his Titan Award, and as one of the other recipients said, who would have thought that the most entertaining person on the stage was the economist? But in fact, he's more than an economist. But who I want to introduce is Maria Elena de la Garza, who's the executive director of the Community Action Board. One of our most respected organizations in the community, and she is one of our most respected leaders, both in our community and on a state and national level. And the reason I asked Maria Elena to pitch in a little bit is because she has had Chris work with her board on solidarity economics. So I'd like you, Maria Elena, just to, however you, 3-4 minutes, whatever you want to do.
Just a couple minutes.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Good evening, everyone. It's such an honor and a blessing to be here with you today. I love this guy. I love this guy. And when I've seen this presentation a couple of times. And when I first saw it, it was with the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. And they're a regional group that work with us to help support economic mobility, economic growth, and important work in our community. You probably know of them. I participated in that workshop, and I said, CAB needs to know this. CAB needs to know this in all the levels of who we are as an agency. And so we celebrate 60 years this year of service. Yay for CAB. And I too am wearing my next job. But when I reached out to Chris, I said, Chris, can you come and talk to the board? And he absolutely said yes. I didn't even have to blink. And he said yes. And why I thought it was so incredibly important is because our board is a very special board. We are a tripartite board. We have 5 low-income representatives, we have 5 elected officials, and we have 5 industry folks. And this information and the way that Chris has framed it, the research that he has done, and how he teaches the research and how he shares, makes it so easy for us to understand and makes systems people able to talk to grassroots people to make stuff happen. And so it's an honor for me to be here and introduce Chris. And I want to share, I don't know about where you all, I don't know if you're watching the news or, avoiding the news or whatever it is today, but, early on, all the community-based organizations got a list of all the forbidden words. Do you all know about this list? Yes. So there is a list of, 250 words or something that the federal government was going to use to evaluate our service delivery, okay? And I had to do this, Chris. I looked at his slide deck that he did at CAB, and then I giggled as I wrote down all the words that are forbidden under this administration. That includes inclusion, equitable, investment, well-being, accountability, transparency, environmental health, resiliency, natural resources, sustainability, transformation, community, consumer participation, equitable investment, and well-being.
Those are all forbidden.
We better draw the blinds.
And so I'm sure there's gonna be more, but that's what it takes right now. It takes courage. It takes courage and advocacy and understanding the landscape in which we find ourselves. We were just saying earlier, I never thought in my lifetime that I would not recognize the country that I am a part of.
Yeah.
And so I want to thank you for this opportunity. Chris, thank you for doing the work that you do. And thank you for translating it in a way so that we understand and we can use it as a tool to move our movement forward. So thank you. I introduce you to Chris.
I don't think there's any way I can live up to that introduction. So thank you all for coming. Good night. We'll be handing out the bingo cards now, so check the words. So, no, really, thank you, really, that was amazing. Thank you, Matt, for hosting. Thank you, Peggy, for organizing. And thank all of you for coming out on a Monday night to talk about economics. That's really one of my favorite activities, is to get together on a Monday night to talk about economics. I know it's not normal, but you all know the kind of person who typically becomes an economist is someone who's really good at math, but doesn't have an engaging enough personality to become an accountant. So that's what you're in for tonight, is some numbers. That's why I'm glad to have the presentation here. I'm glad we could get that to work. And hopefully it won't put you to sleep as we're talking about economics, because we're talking about a different kind of economics and a way to try and rethink our economy in a way that works for all. This is work that I've done in collaboration with a longtime friend and collaborator, Manuel Pastor, who's currently a professor at the University of Southern California, USC. We also talk about that as the University of Stolen Colleagues. He used to be a UCSC banana slug, but they stole him away. We have 6 books together now and have been collaborating for more than a quarter of a century. And the work that's represented here is in a book called Solidarity Economics. It's not just a book, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it represents some research and rethinking we've been doing, sparked by what's going on in the world, right? Starting with the financial crisis in 2008, which was a shock to all of us about the things that weren't working in our system. But then, of course, the backlash to our first black president, Trump 1.0, the COVID crisis, and what that revealed about the vulnerabilities in our society and the racial inequality that was so deeply embedded in our society and in the vulnerabilities to the pandemic, and whatever we got going now with Trump 2.0. But part of what's underpinning that is a demographic transition in the U.S. The United States will be majority people of color, roughly 2043, 2044, something like that. I want you to look at sort of this transition from 2000, where you've got roughly 69% non-Hispanic white, to 2040, 2050, where we'll get majority people of color. That 50-year transition happened in California in the space of 20 years. It's 1980 to 2000. And if any of you were around California during that time, you'll remember it was a time of anti-affirmative action. It was xenophobia, anti-immigrants, and all the efforts to try and exclude immigrants from the social policies that we had in the state. It was a time of 3 strikes laws and increasing mass incarceration. Pretty scary time. A lot of reverberations for today. And look where we are in California today, right? Yeah. But part of what's happened in the meantime is a deepening of our economic crisis and economic inequality. So this is a chart that shows, going back to 1917, the income distribution in the U.S. by different income groups. And the most important one to look at there is the blue line, which is the proportion of total income captured by the top 1%, right? which is up to about 27% of total income captured by the top 1%. Unprecedented, the highest level of income inequality that we know of existing in this country, certainly for over 100 years. This is a little bit of what it looks like in California compared to the US. This shows sort of the lowest income earners on the left, up to the highest income earners on the right. The gray is the United States. The gold color is the Golden State. And part of what you see is over this 42-year period, actually declining wages in the bottom half of the labor market. Despite economic growth, so that top chart shows in inflation-adjusted terms, the growth in the economic output, gross domestic product, per worker, from 1975 up to 2023, almost doubled the total amount of output per worker, and adjusted for inflation, right, up to over 160,000 per worker. But this shows on the bottom the decline of the share of total income going to the bottom 90%. That cumulative amount over that time period is $79 trillion. If we had the same distribution of income today that we had in 1975, that would have been a redistribution of $79 trillion from the top 10% to the rest of us. And the median household income today would be currently double, roughly, what it is, 160,000 rather than 80,000. So that income inequality, of course, has racial dimensions to it also. This is the median wage by race. Latino and Black workers earning about 2/3 of what the typical white worker earns. And people think, well, education is the solution. I work at a university, so I think education is part of the solution, but that doesn't solve inequality. And what this chart shows is that at every educational attainment level, less than high school diploma, some college, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, continued racial inequality in the median wages by income level. And that's just income, right? That wealth inequality chart that I first showed you, that was income inequality. If you were to look at wealth inequality, it's even higher. The main way that people in our society accumulate assets is through home ownership. So 95%, that's their main earnings or main assets. And non-Hispanic white population, almost 3/4 of non-Hispanic white households are in owner-occupied units, compared to Latino, Pacific Islander, and Black, where it's less than 50%. So the wealth inequality drives even more inequality. And then, the best of times, the worst of times. Over on the left is what's happened with the worldwide billionaire wealth over the last 20 years. Shot up to where we now have almost 3,000 billionaires in the world. Almost 1,000 of them are in the US, with a total wealth of $16 trillion. So that's on the one side. So on the other side, 37% of Americans can't access $400 in an emergency. Right? That's that close to living on the edge, being on the street. But even more shocking to me when I saw this statistic is by age 60, 4 out of 5 Americans will have experienced at least a year of poverty or joblessness in the wealthiest country on the planet. And since we were talking about the pandemic earlier, even despite the Affordable Care Act improving access to health insurance, 26 million adults are without any form of health insurance today, and another 66 million who are underinsured in different ways. I could go on with lots of other statistics and we'd go away feeling really discouraged. it's clear something's not working. And it hasn't been working for half a century. It's time for a change. It's time for us to think differently about our economy and figure out different solutions. And for inspiration, I turned to someone that us lefty professors at UC Santa Cruz don't typically turn to.
Yeah.
But the godfather of neoliberal economics, who wrote in the late 50s in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, that it's only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. We're certainly in a crisis. And there's an opportunity to build a new vision, right? And I think that's what we're all struggling for at the moment, is like, what is that new vision? But it's also important to recognize that it's not just ideas lying around, right? There are people, movements, organizations who are sharing those ideas, implementing those ideas in different places, and trying to demonstrate the impact of it. And on the neoliberal side, this is an incredibly important book that most people have never heard of, by actually a political scientist at Michigan, Elizabeth Pott Berman, because we often think of the rise of neoliberalism as tied with Ronald Reagan, 1980, the Republican administration, right? And University of Chicago economists, for those who know economics. But in fact, Elizabeth Berman goes back to show the ways that during the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, a whole group of economists, including many from Harvard and other sort of more liberal institutions in the economics realm, were brought into government and started talking about efficiency rather than equality and opportunity. Like if you think about the New Deal and what came out of the 1930s, and a lot of the post-World War II efforts around the GI Bill and access to housing, was really all about government's role in building the safety net, in supporting equality and opportunity. And these economists came in and started talking about efficiency with the best of intentions, right? How do we make good use of government dollars to get the most bang for the buck and get things out? But it changed the way we understand both our economy and the role of government. And it points to the importance of an economic frame. Because part of what it does is it links economic theory and data with a worldview of how we understand what's causing the problems that we see in the world. Right? And this was a worldview that said, if there are people who are still in poverty, it's because our government's not efficient enough, right? Rather than looking at the structural causes of poverty and how do we build mutual aid and support, just for example. And part of what a worldview does is it shapes not only policies, but it shapes interactions, communication, right? How we can relate to other people. Again, if someone is unhoused, is it their lack of individual responsibility? Or is it the result of a set of structural obstacles in our housing markets and labor markets? Right? And that's like one of the conflicts that we get stuck in this society that you all know about so well. Okay, so here's moving into the solutions. We wrote this book, Solidarity Economics, which was not written in the ivory tower. It was written out of 25 years of experience of working with community organizations like the Community Action Board and labor unions and environmental justice groups and people all over this country who have been trying to implement a different idea, a different way of understanding the world and our economy and economic opportunity. There is a book. There is a website, solidarittyeconomics.org. There is a comic book, and I have a little more than a handful, 2 handfuls to hand out tonight. So yeah, get excited about that. It's in both English and Spanish. If you don't get one tonight, you can order it off of the website. There's a PDF version of it, or you can order a printed version. There's videos. We're trying to get these ideas out there. And if you want the academic research behind what I'm about to share, get the book. I was going to say buy the book, but you actually don't have to buy the book, because in solidarity with our readers, you can actually download it for free. But one of the things that happens when you write a book is you realize at the end that you know that it's done, when you have a title. It's the last thing you do. But we realized in this case that we can explain what's in the book in 3 key concepts, 3 sentences, really. So get your notes out. There will be a test. Here's the first thing. 3 main points. We should always talk about our economy, not the economy. Our economy is a reminder that economies aren't created by nature. They don't respond to fundamental laws of physics or God. They are created by people. They represent all the values and power relationships that are in our society. And because of that, we can change them. And one of the key aspects of this is about how we construct markets. For most economists, markets are a black box, right? Buyers and sellers get together, price signals, determine supply and demand, magic happens, efficient allocation. But in fact, markets have to be constructed to bring buyers and sellers together. And whether you are, say, zoning land for a farmer's market that prioritizes local growers to access healthy food, or whether you're zoning land for a big box Walmart grocery store that's buying mass goods somewhere else, those are 2 different value sets. Housing markets. How you're constructing where housing can be built, how it can be built, how dense, right? That's creating a market for the types of housing that is built and created and bought and sold, and who has access to that. And our whole history of racial covenants is part of that. So any market that's out there, whether it's Wall Street or your basic clothing and food, is constructed. And part of it is trying to understand what are the values and power relationships that are embedded in those markets. But here's the second point. Mutuality matters. Our current economy is dependent as much on care, on collaboration, on cooperation, as it is competition. But our neoliberal economic theory blinds us to all those elements of cooperation and collaboration. We live in the shadow of Silicon Valley. If you understand that industry at all, you know it's not driven by Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg and the great man theory of tech. It's driven by, hundreds of years of scientific research, dozens of years of investment in early stage development in the semiconductor industry, semiconductors, the internet, natural language processing, image recognition, machine learning algorithms. All of that starts from public investment. And it's the relationship between all the different types of firms and the intellectual property lawyers and the technicians and the community colleges and universities in the area that creates that dynamic growth. I have the same argument about the entertainment industry, about the tourism industry that is part of our industry here in Monterey and Santa Cruz counties, right? Sure, there's competition that goes on, but success is as much about our ability to protect our natural environment, to have collective advertising, that attracts people to this area, all that goes along with that. And it turns out, looking at the research, that equality is good for economics. Those places that are more equal do better in traditional economic terms than those that are unequal. And this chart shows, this is a complex regression equation I won't bore you with, but looking at what are the factors that predict derailing sustained growth, moving into a recession. Looking at the largest 200 metropolitan regions in the country, that's an important economic unit, those places that are more unequal are more likely to hit a recession sooner. But interestingly also, those places that are more racially segregated, those places that are more government fragmented, local government fragmented, less collaboration, and more politically divided, also have economic problems. Politically divided is interesting because, again, there was no correlation with predominantly Republican or predominantly Democrat. But those regions that had greater disparity in voting patterns between different parts of the region had greater problems. When you can't collaborate, when you can't communicate, when you can't cooperate, you can't compete effectively. You need them both. It's one of the things we have a hard time doing as Americans is holding two thoughts at the same time in our head. You need both. But here's the third point. Our economy exists the way it does, not by chance. Some people are benefiting from our current economic structures, and they have a lot of power. And so as we're talking about economic change, we have to always be talking about whose voice is at the table, whose voice is being heard and listening to, and how do we challenge the dominant forces in our economy in ways that can shift those power relationships. Because that has better economic benefits and outcomes, as well as better social and political outcomes as well. Okay, so that's the frame. What do you do with that frame? What kind of difference does it make? What does that look in the real world? Well, again, get the book. Lots of ideas in there. But I'll share a few examples. So one is, with a perspective on solidarity economics and the importance of care and collaboration and caring, we might see the importance of the care economy. That orange line there is total employment in California in all sorts of care jobs: nursing care, elder care, family care, home health care, child care services, substantially more than in all high-tech jobs, and growing faster. And with our aging workforce, that's only going to increase over time. So if we really care about our economic future, we should be investing in increasing wages for early childhood education positions, right? But to do that, you got to talk about power. We have to challenge, for instance, what do we mean by skilled labor? We actually know how to train someone to write an artificial intelligence algorithm. Not that hard. But how do you train someone to be a critical thinker? How do you train someone to work with a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, deal with their emotional challenges and issues and when they're crying, and help them become a motivated lifelong learner? How do you care for an elder person, help them wash themselves and do their bodily functions with dignity and love, and recognize that so it can be rewarded with higher wages? Like, there's some of us that have ideas how we might do that, but we actually don't know. That's skilled labor. That's hard to recognize, that labor, and yet we all know someone who's that caregiver who needs to be rewarded more. We also, of course, need to challenge the low public funding and support for care work across the board. Here's another thing we might see. That medical treatment is not the promotion of health. If we're treating someone, it's mean we have missed a whole series of steps along the way. It's so much more expensive to treat someone with diabetes than to help them be healthy, active, eating good foods, preventing it getting to that point. So we should be investing in the social and economic determinants of health. That's the academic term. That gets way upstream from the point of where we actually get to medical treatment. But of course, to get there, we need to challenge the medical establishment and their dominance of our health insurance and medical assessment. We need, of course, universal health insurance and investing in that public health infrastructure. With the solidarity economics framework, we might recognize our mutuality with our planet. There's a whole chapter in the book on that. And no surprise, climate change is expensive, right? And this is just one measure of that, is the disasters. This is a measure that NOAA keeps track of. Take a photo of this now because next year NOAA is going to be decimated and you probably want to have this data. Sad. But, it shows the number of disasters of all kind that are at least $1 billion in impact. And it totals at the moment about $500 for every man, woman, and child in the U.S. that we're paying just for those $1 billion disasters of climate change. And it turns out that when you look at some of the other environmental challenges, bad air, polluted water, etc., the places where there is greater racial disparities in exposure is worse for everyone, including white people. And our understanding of that is if you think you can insulate yourselves from the polluting factory or the polluted water, and it's just the other that's going to be exposed to that. In fact, you're less likely to confront the fundamental problem and challenge, which is lack of solidarity with our planet and our environment. So that's another example. Workforce, adult education. Our current workforce development system, adult training, is deficit-oriented, right? It's focused on providing technical training to job seekers without recognizing the tremendous skills and experience and motivations they bring to their work in the labor market. Whether it's formal training and skills they may have gotten in another country that aren't recognized here, or whether it's the uncertified professional skills, not soft skills, that employers tell us are so important. Critical thinking, intercultural communication, motivation, all those kind of things that are critical and part of that. This is a chart that shows as a proportion of total economic output how much countries spend on adult education and learning. That tiny little red mark down there, that's us. That's all of our advanced economic comparative countries. So part of what we need to do is build a system that recognizes the assets in marginalized communities throughout this country, working with the community organizations that are so well positioned to recognize those assets and help translate them to employers who are actually really looking for that talent that's currently on the sidelines, but you want to bring into the mainstream of the economy, our economy. And we also need to figure out how to invest more in that. I'm going to tell a couple more stories, but I really want to get your input to all of this. So I'm going to do a few stories and then ask for your feedback. Because the stories are designed to point to ways that regions around the country have been trying to implement in their different ways this investment in mutuality. And we did a study, I showed you some of the quantitative statistics of the largest 200 metropolitan regions in the country. We also wrote this previous book that had in-depth case studies of 11 places around the country. And one of the things we discovered is that sharing information and knowledge about what's going on in their regional economies is critical for growing together. Those places that are successful at building those knowledge communities grow faster, grow in a more sustained way than places that don't have those kind of connections. It doesn't mean there isn't conflict. But it does mean that there is a series of processes that these regions have gone through that keep people in conversation and minimize the disruptive conflict. And so conflict becomes a source of innovation and dynamism and new learning rather than division. We talked about the 3 R's, where part of what it does is help people recognize common roots in a region and a commitment to ongoing relationships in which data, reason, dialogue is the basis for ongoing work, rather than ideology, othering, demonization of others. But it takes investment and time. So let me just share a few examples. One of which is San Antonio, Texas, where in the 1970s, there was an organizing group called COPS Metro, organizing in the West Side Latino, Chicano neighborhoods in very disruptive ways against the business class in the region. Occupying the banks, occupying retail establishments in different ways, huge conflict. And that was transformed over time into a situation of collaboration that included renovation of a downtown neighborhood and Riverwalk. If anyone's been to San Antonio, it's a beautiful kind of tourist downtown area. It's led to a situation in which the Chamber of Commerce was a leading voice for increased taxes on the business class in the area to invest in early childhood education because they recognized that it was a payoff 20 years down the road for a more skilled workforce.
Yeah.
And how did they get there? Well, part of it was you had that strong community organizing base, but you had a business leadership that was willing to listen and understand. And Henry Cisneros, who was mayor at the time in the 1980s, was a really critical bridge builder. Someone who had the trust, some would say token leadership position in the business class, but also had the trust and deep roots in these poor Latino Chicano communities. Julian Castro is the other mayor that came along a couple of decades later, who's now very active here in California in the Latino Community Foundation. So conflict led to collaboration and cooperation. Kansas City is a complex place with very fragmented local government. It's actually a 2-state region, 9 counties, forget the exact number, of dozens and dozens and dozens of cities. In this case, it was a government entity, the Mid-America Regional Council, that helped pull the region together. Now, every metropolitan region in the country has what's called a Metropolitan Planning Organization, MPO, because you can't get federal transportation dollars unless you plan your transportation for the region and how it links with population changes. Most MPOs only deal with transportation planning. A few of them will do a little bit of land use connected with that. In the Mid-America Regional Council, they had programs that they're collaborating across all these local governments in everything from early childhood education to services for the elderly and aging, to environmental services. They even had a foreign trade division, economic development services, comprehensive set of programs driven by data. They put together this Metro Outlook Live, which had a series of indicators on the triple bottom line. Green is environment, natural capital, blue was economics, the red was social and social investments. And again, that data-driven process helped pull together the region as a whole. Salt Lake City is a place where government wasn't going to be the solution. It's a very conservative state, even though actually the city of Salt Lake is much more liberal. But here, a nonprofit organization, Envision Utah, did a lot of that regional planning that the Mid-America Regional Council was doing, including transportation planning, and they put together a light rail system that was actually really critical in linking the airport through a series of low-income neighborhoods to downtown and some of the suburban regions, giving greater access to job opportunities in the region. They had a brilliant advertising campaign, actually, too, because they were appealing to automobile drivers. Like, why would an automobile driver care about investing in a light rail system? And it was because the roads would be clearer, right? Freedom of the road. They actually had this whole amazing advertisement that was part of that. It was really cool. But the other important institution in this place is the Mormon Church. And the Mormon Church has a particular structure where the leaders of the local congregation or church unit are not permanent pastors. They rotate through every 3 to 7 years. They're typically business leaders, public leaders, all men, still to this day pretty much. One of the things they do is operate a provident fund. Mormons give a lot of charity to people in need. And where else do you have a system in this country where major business leaders get direct experience as social workers on an ongoing basis, right? And what kind of understanding does that change? They also are very open to immigrants. And part of that is because there are large Mormon communities in Mexico, in Peru, other places in Latin America, and they recognize the importance of immigrant workers in the Utah economy. And they developed a set of principles in the 90s, I believe, maybe early 2000s, about how they were going to talk about the role of immigration and immigrants in Utah. And one of the things it started from was keeping families together. And again, same outcomes in terms of improved economy, improved social outcomes. So there are other stories there, but I'd really love to get you into this conversation. You know, the key thing that we're trying to say in this work, and I say we, not just me and Manuel, but the communities that helped inform this book and that we continue to work with on an ongoing basis, is that now is not the time for incremental proposals alone. We need a fundamental transformation in how our economy operates. It's time for a vision, not just issues. And again, it's time to do two things at the same time, hold two ideas. You know, we've got to protect our community as a threat in this moment, and we've got to be building for that 20-year vision of where we need to go. And part of that is showing the future we can have by building the future we want in our own communities and connections. So that's kind of what I got. But what I'd love to do to bring you into the conversation is, if I could have you all stand up. And in a second, I'm going to ask you to find someone you don't know, or if you know everyone in the room, find someone you don't usually talk to. And Peggy, I'm looking at you. And I want you to talk to each other about three things. One is what resonates with you from what I've said. Two, what's missing, right? This only gets better if it's constantly evolving and changing, right? And I want to know, in your mind, in your world, what's missing I didn't talk about that the room should know about. And then the third thing is, what are you dying to ask? So take, 7 to 10 minutes, find someone, talk, and then we'll come back and have a larger discussion. Go. So what I'd love to do is just broaden the conversation, hopefully not end the conversation, but bring back into the whole room the things that you were talking about that you want to share with the whole room. So who's ready? Yeah.
I'm ready. My point is that in all of these things, which are wonderfully presented, there is no discussion of the income inequality between men and women, and the differences between the ages, and that's really it. Because like for example, if you look at Equal Pay Day, I don't know if people really know what Equal Pay Day is, but it's the first Equal Pay Day is the time in the spring when a white woman's salary, when what she earns from the beginning of the year to that date, together with what she earned the year before, is the same as what the men earned the year before. And then you go to Latinas, and then you go to African Americans. And I don't see that reflected in any of those statistics up there.
Love
Sorry.
it.
but-
No, perfect. Thank you. I have them. I will put them in the next presentation. One of the things that's interesting about the age difference is not just changes in earnings, but the increasing insecurity of employment at younger ages. It just takes longer for people to get rooted in a job now than it did 30 years ago, when there was a clear path, maybe 50, 60 years ago, into the factory or the job. Now it's a lot harder to find
Except
a
you
spot.
have the people that are like jumping like this from job to job, because that's what they think they should be doing.
Well, and some make a good job of that, and
Yeah.
others are job to
Yeah.
job to job in
Yeah.
low
Yeah,
paid
low income,
service sector jobs. So
Right.
appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of like the frog image with the economy. When I was in undergrad and grad school, I made anywhere between like $10 and $18 an hour. And my son and kids his age in their 20s now, you get a job and it's between 12 and 18, if you're lucky, 25 an hour. It's more around that 18. It's just despicable because they can't live. But it's kind of affected us like a frog in the water that's turned up slowly. And older people, I say people who are in their 60s and older, don't have the same sense of what economy is compared to young people who are in their 40s and younger, of how it's impacting young people. So older people, not everyone, not, of course but people who are really set in their ways don't see how the difference that has grown in the wealth gap, and how young people are struggling so terribly much.
Yeah. Your comments also made me think a bit about the eroding value of the minimum wage. That's kind of the flip side of inflation, right? Is that the federal minimum wage is $7.50 for most workers. It's $2.13 for tipped workers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And it's been that way for 40 years or something like that.
In your shift, you can't even buy a sandwich.
Yeah.
So our group had a lot of resonance with the local examples that you shared. And the fact that, there was a broker in between these different groups to help get the conversation started and have cross-education happening. And then we were also impressed that you could do things locally, especially now when it doesn't feel like you can really make a big impact on the federal government. But as someone who's been a climate activist and researcher, like, you know, that is such a huge problem that could collapse the whole economy in a relatively short period of time. That, like, do you have, I mean, so I can also see, okay, locally, we could start to role model what the best things to do are locally, like, that would be good. Do you think about scaling up? Do you feel like there's an importance in local and staying local, or do you feel like you could certainly do this nationally and you see some hope there at all? I mean, maybe not right now, but maybe hopefully. When we change regimes.
I know. I look for hope in everything. So I think about scaling up every day. I think it's really important. Your comments also reminded me of the quote that's on the door to the office where I work at UC Santa Cruz with all the students that are part of that, which is, you know, never doubt that a small committed group of people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret. And we need to be working locally and nationally and globally. I think, again, it's both and. And I think part of that is finding the networks of people that are working on the issues that we care about locally so that we can be rooted in our own work and have that grounding, but recognize that there are people doing that all over the world and trying to create it. When you were talking about hope and you know what I look for in the moment, I mean, Harvard today resisted the Trump administration, right?
Finally.
And we kept pointing to these elite Ivy League institutions, like if anyone had the financial wherewithal, like they should be doing it. And of course, I didn't have much hope for that. But, you know, at least they came out verbally in opposition to the Trump administration. I was just looking at the headlines. Trump has frozen $2.2 billion in contracts, right? So it doesn't come without a price. But hopefully, you know, I don't know if people know, there were 60 universities that were on a list, like word list. And what's been remarkable to me is how little they have come together in a unified opposition to the interference with our educational systems. And, you know, maybe now with Harvard taking a stand, it'll spark more of a unified response, because that's what we need. And the scale of the problems we face at the moment require that global with climate change, certainly national response. But I think if it's not rooted in the local work, it's not going to have the power that it needs to move the needle. Yeah, Marilyn, I want to.
Yeah, I wanted to share one of my, what I shared in the group about how inclusion and diversity and equity really impacts pocketbooks, right? And just sharing really briefly, you know, CAB used to be primarily a white agency, you know, a white governed, a white administered, and a white managed agency. And 12 years ago, when the board invited me to come, really clearly set the stage to say, you all need to reflect the community that you serve. And that was, it's been a long process, and I'm very happy to say we are reflecting the community that we serve. And how that has impacted our budget. We've grown from a $2 million budget to a $12, $14, $16 million budget. So we're a living example of your work, right? Because when you diversify, when you bring in different ideas, when you bring in different strengths and assets, your work changes and you serve the community better.
Yeah.
And when you serve the community better, relationships happen and money flows.
Yeah. Caitlin, and then we'll come here, and then we'll come to you.
Yeah, kind of building from that, and your point, Chris, that was almost lost, but the thinking like an economist, the point that our theories, policies, and our narratives, the narratives, how they shape our worldview, and the person who tells the more compelling story, in a way, holds incredible influence over how things go down. And so just to bring to consciousness that abolitionists were only ever 2% of the population, and yet we were gradually able to transform the system of slavery. what are the stories that we want to be sharing? Reeling the story of the transformation of CAB, so that at a community level, we can begin to proliferate those positive stories and have that be the flywheel that creates the change.
Yeah, and sharing those stories, and it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a former mayor of Santa Cruz, and first of all, your data presentation was fantastic. I need that slide deck.
Thank you.
Teach at the university.
I'll share it with Peggy, and she can share it to
I'll
her.
go to your website.
Okay.
Get the book and make that happen. I teach my students, if we had the resources to carry out the kind of program that you're talking about, funding childcare, funding adult education, funding medical stuff before it gets to become medical, health issues, we obviously would be in a whole different path. The city of Santa Cruz at one point in the 80s spent more per capita when the progressives took over on social services than any other city in the country for about a 3-year period. We're still probably in the top 10 or 12 or something, but despite, we went from 80,000 to eventually $2 million a year in social programs. Okay, not nothing, but a drop in the bucket. When it comes to, we didn't transform the child care system. We didn't transform the health system for seniors in our community. You look at in terms of the resources being there, and I mentioned this, that, when Eisenhower was president, that radical left-wing guy, the corporate tax rate on the top 500 corporations was 90%. Today it's 14. If you look at the Prop 13, not from 90 to 14. Think about the money you would have to do what we're talking about here. Or look at the property tax. There's a reason for Prop 13 on residences, but a split tax roll that taxes 2/3 of the property that's not residential would bring in so much money, we wouldn't know what to do with it almost in terms of what you're talking about. But we put that on the ballot, the split tax roll. We outspent 10 to 1, and we only lost 2 to 1. 2 to 1's a beating. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about what it is that gets it. I mean, even the city can start at that level. The city should do that. What Santa Cruz has done. Some are doing it. You've got some examples where they're doing that in other places. But what is it that would allow us to scale up and actually get after that 90%? I mean, we're not going to go back to 90, but to some higher tax rates. To go,
why not? I mean,
well, because you have problems with other countries' capital flow out. But you can certainly get to, like, instead of 14, you could have 20 or 25 or 30 to start. And what thoughts do you have about how do you get out of this idea where you bring up these ideas that are totally reasonable, that meet people's needs, and people they don't understand that their self-interest is in this in some way, and they think, oh, taxes are too high, and it wouldn't be taxes on you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what are your thoughts about how do you break out of this idea that, my God, billionaires know what the answers are, and we should just sort of
Let them do
run them up?
it. Yeah. That's a really good question. It's a really hard question. Next. No, sorry. I mean, the first thing that you pointed that I think is really important is the myth of scarcity. Right? We have been so taught that we are in a scarce resource environment. Like 79 trillion, is that enough for you?
Yeah.
Like that's just getting back to where we were in 1975 in terms of income distribution. Like we could have done a lot with that.
3 years of the GDP of the country.
Exactly. The whole GDP of the country.
Times
350
for 3
million
years.
people. So the question is, where are those resources and how do we get access to them? And that's the hard question. You talked about the loss we endured in the Schools and Communities First initiative, Prop 13 reform. And that was a tough loss. It happened in the pandemic when the traditional ground game of the advocates for that initiative, who spent a long time building for that proposition, working in community organizations, working in labor movements, doing a lot of the narrative testing, figuring out how we talk about it, how we put it together, had the organizing base for it, and said, they actually thought about putting it on the ballot in 2018, but decided to put it in the general election ballot because the polling and their organizing showed that a higher turnout was a more likely avenue of success. I still believe to this day that if we hadn't had the pandemic, that proposition would have passed. And part of the lesson from that is, elections are important, but you can't count on elections alone. It's got to be the organizing behind it that goes along with it. People talk about this model of integrated voter engagement, right? So you're doing all the kind of things that CAB does, of working around, the challenges of day laborers and affordable housing and all the services, and integrating that into, through different networks, get out the vote efforts. Where instead of the traditional model where, the parties will either outspend the opposition 20-1 or 290 million, whatever Musk spent.
Well, one of the taxes 50-1.
51. Yeah. But, instead of people from outside the community coming in and door knocking for, a few weekends before the election, your neighbor is the one who's like, hey, have you voted yet? Are you going to get out to vote? Are you registered? And can follow up the week after. Hey, you said you were going to vote, and actually we don't have the record that you voted. What happened? And where that kind of integrated voter engagement is happening, so people see that civic engagement is about caring about those who are unhoused, caring about the education in our schools, caring about the local issues on the zoning board or whatever it is, and getting out to vote, that it can really shift the needle. Because in many of those struggles, it's a few percentage points. I mean, Trump won nationally by, small margin. I don't know if people have looked at the map of, I show this to my students, I probably could pull it up, but, Reagan won in a landslide, right? He won all but 3 states in 1980 and all but 1 in 84, right? Trump is holding on by a razor-thin margin and claiming it's a mandate, and that gives me some hope. But anyway, we could talk a lot about our political system and the challenges to democracy here, but the key message is integrating that community organizing with voting, not voting alone, I think is what's critical. So Dennis, and then Aaron.
Yeah, I'll try and make it short. You mentioned neoliberal economics, and I wonder how many people know what it is, but if you say it's sort of unbridled shareholder capitalism and trickle-down economics, basically every 2-term American president since Ronald Reagan has been a strong adherent of neoliberal economics. And one of the things that frustrates me about our politics is that if you're a Democrat, people say Clinton was a hero and Reagan was Satan. And actually, if you look at their economics, they both did pretty terrible things to the middle class. Bill Clinton did NAFTA, repealed Glass-Steagall, which set the stage for the 2008 mortgage collapse. So I guess what frustrates me is that neither party really owns their economic issues very much.
Yeah.
And what your whole presentation is kind of proving that economics is the foundation of everything, including our social problems. You can even take, a lightning rod issue like DEI and recast that in more economic terms. I don't know what I'm saying other than that.
Own your economics.
I wish our politics were more about economic facts.
Yeah.
And parties that actually owned the mistakes they were made. You look at the last election, I think the Democrats blew a huge opportunity.
Yeah. And I'm not a political scientist, and I read in that area, but one of the things that's striking to me is how many successful, in terms of getting elected, presidents ran as outsiders. Right? I mean, Reagan was the movie actor who ran against Washington, right? Clinton was the outsider, the new generation who was going to bring a new to Washington, right? Obama, right? The community organizer who's like, people are hungry for change. We have had incredible success over the last 10 years in breaking down barriers to voting. And more people vote now than at any point in our history. We're at 60% of the adult electorate that vote. Every election, there are more people who don't vote than the winning party. All right? That is a sign of our disenchantment. And I didn't show these specifics too, but if you look at the confidence the American public has in major institutions, right? The presidency in 1975 was up in the 60% of Americans had a confidence in the presidency, not the president, but the presidency as an institution. We're down to 25% now. Congress started at that point.
Yeah.
We're in single digits now. It's like 7%. Right? Universities. We used to be at 70%. Right? The latest polls has us under 50% of the American population has confidence in universities as an institution.
But it's higher than the presidency.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Just saying.
But the point is, like, people are hungry for a different reality, right? And I'm convinced that if we had a candidate who was espousing solidarity economics in the right narrative, they would win in a landslide. Sorry?
Didn't we have that with Bernie Sanders?
And the mainstream of the Democratic Party cut him off at the knees. I hate to say that, but that's what happened.
And that's the opportunity that
And
they
Elizabeth
lost.
Warren.
Yeah. Sorry, you had it. Come on.
I really appreciate your presentation. For me, as a former educator and administrator, there's an aspect of what we value. And I think that we've lost, as a nation, what are the things that are important? I think CAB, this community came together because they saw a value in a segment of our population that was in need, and so they kind of rose to that. And so I think that some of the community organizing you're talking about, you can have political differences, but you can still have common values.
Amen.
Whereas, as opposed to the other, it's all of us. Despite our differences, or even our income, inequality, there's something really lacking in this humanistic, I'm from the way back, humanistic, was a big thing in education. A humanistic point of view. We've lost that.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we get back to it, but we're so divided through politics and economic inequality and so many other things that we've lost touch with our
Humanity, yeah, and people, yeah. We'll take a few more comments and then I want to make sure you get out of here by 8:30. So
yeah, my comment is very similar to yours. I work in the arts and really here curious about the role that arts can play and the kind of systems change. And as I listen to this, I hear that underneath it all, what is necessary is a values change and a culture change. And I love the graphs. I'm a numbers guy, and I love the information. You're an economist, but that's not going to get my kids to care about something different. And so what I feel like is missing, and where there's room for something, is where's that cultural fire that can tell the stories that can really inspire the kind of change that will drive community organizing and elections in a way that the kinds of problems that you talked about, Mike, can be solved because we're solving the root of the problem as opposed to trying to address the symptoms.
So, little pitch for arts. I'm going to hand out my comic book now. This was an alumni of the program that I run. Sorry I don't have copies for everyone, but you can get it on that thing. And I totally, every movement in the world that's been successful has had music as part of it, has had art that's been a critical part of it. Yeah. Let's take one more comment and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I think we're getting to the meat of where I think about the root causes or the root value, the root to how we can address these issues. And one of the things I think about is that for example, when you talk about far-right Christian, they say, well, it's family values. We want family values. And yet, the very economics that they put in play undermines family values by not, you look at Denmark and you look at other countries that a person has a baby and mothers get a year to 2 years to stay home with their kids. And even the fathers get
gets a year.
A year to stay home. So we really don't put money behind our values. So what I think truly is that our foundation right now is the pursuit of the material, materialism, and money over everything. And one of my big personal issues too is, and this goes back to environmental policies, like if we destroy our environment, we're destroying ourselves. So we don't put our money behind what we say we value. And I notice even in Santa Cruz, there's young people who are afraid of nature, afraid of the environment, and our built environment is learning more and more to exclude that nature. And so it's really critical for our children to be in nature and to have that wild experience, to enable them to grow in ways. I say that there is more to be learned in nature. I grew up on a farm and I grew up backpacking in nature. There's more to be learned in nature than you can learn in the classroom anyway. And so getting every kid should have time in nature. They shouldn't be put in buildings for daycare. They should be outside.
Thank you all for spending your Monday night with me talking economics.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to Dr. Weinstein for sponsoring us, another wonderful event here. And Kristen, thank you again, and the other staff for helping us do everything. What we need to do is push our chairs in just a second and help me throw out the popcorn or whatever it is, or take some. We might have some bags. If a couple of people asked me about joining the DWC, including you don't have to live in our county, you can join and then be a non-voting member, but just go on our website and vote. We have a new treasurer here who's happy to take your money however you get it to her. Yeah.
Is this being taped?
Yes. Okay.
So it'll be on our
Yes,
website.
it'll be on our website. We'll send it out to people, yeah. So thank you again. Thank you.